People at some of the world's biggest charities abusing their powers and extremely vulnerable people. Is the entire industry, if you can call it that, now tainted with the sex scandals that have recently come to light? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Well, those claims of sexual misconduct are on the way up, implicating a growing number of charities. So what does it mean for a sector that exists to do good, but is now facing a serious image problem?
A culture of cover-ups and aid workers operating with impunity. Oxfam is embroiled in an ongoing sex scandal, and UN peacekeepers are accused of over 600 cases of sexual abuse. Can the aid sector survive a crisis of trust? After an earthquake tore through Haiti in 2010, claiming 316,000 lives and displacing 1.5 million people, the country became the epicenter of humanitarian relief efforts. But some are accused of taking advantage of the chaos. Oxfam says it investigated allegations of sexual misconduct in 2011, but it's been accused of a cover-up, along with bullying and intimidation of those who came forward. The Charities Commission is demanding urgent clarification on whether the investigation was buried. Oxfam receives around $44 million of British government funding every year. But the money has been suspended while the claims are investigated. The British International Development Secretary says charities must clean up their act or risk being cut off.
Unless you safeguard everyone in your organisation that comes into contact with you, including beneficiaries, staff and volunteers, we will not fund you.
But Oxfam isn't the only aid organisation to be hit with a scandal. The UN has faced accusations of sexual misconduct for decades.
People who trust the UN flag. They see a peacekeeper coming their way, they think, this is someone who's going to help me. They don't think, I gotta run, this is somebody who's going to rape me. That's not what they think. That's not what they should ever think.
An investigation by the Associated Press found that between 2004 and 2016, the United Nations received almost 2,000 allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse against its peacekeepers. More than 700 allegations were from the Congo, home to the UN's largest peacekeeping force. When the UN peacekeeping force was established, its soldiers were granted immunity from prosecution. The accused were often moved to new postings or sent home. It's believed the Oxfam scandal will deter top donors and could affect the entire charity sector. Charity watchdogs are calling for greater transparency, suggesting a new era of accountability for the humanitarian sector.
Well, a new era is sort of what's wanted. We'll be talking about that, among other things. I'm pleased to say that joining us from Washington, we have former UN consultant Laurie Handrahan, more than 20 years' experience in the human rights sector in Central Asia, Africa, and the Balkans. At the round table with me, we have Andrew MacLeod, former Chief of Operations at the UN's Emergency Coordination Centre. Toby Cadman's here, an international law specialist. He focuses on the field of war crimes and human rights. And we also have Fadlullah Wilmot, Regional Manager of Muslim Aid's Middle East and Africa programme. Thank you all very much indeed. Laurie, we'll come to you in just a moment in the US. But Andrew, you run an organisation called Hear Their Cries, which is about people being able to say where things have gone wrong for them at the hands of charity workers and members of the United Nations. And you say that simply wearing a UNICEF T-shirt is licence for people to commit sexual crimes. Where did this all go wrong?
The National Crime Authority has been warning since 1999 that as we crack down on pedophilia in the developed world, the predatory pedophiles now go to the developing world. It's disgusting but logical, and their chosen methodology to get access to children is to join a children's charity. Also disgusting but logical. If I stood outside a primary school in Britain with a trench coat on, the the police would be called within half an hour. If I stand outside a school in the Democratic Republic of Congo with a UNICEF t-shirt on, not only will the police not be called, but the children will run around me asking for lollies and handouts. And this is why there is a higher than normal obligation on charities to do everything they can in training, prevention, detection, and critically prosecution to send the signal to the dysfunctional people that the aid world is no longer a soft target.
We talk about a culture of impunity here. Toby, what does it take to change something like that?
Well, what we're seeing at the moment is not only a culture of impunity, but what we've said is active concealment, that there is almost an accepted policy that this exists, and that those in positions of authority, whether it's in the senior management of the UN or whether it's the CEOs of the charities, that they are not addressing the problem. We haven't seen any cases of active prosecution of either those that are carrying out these horrific acts or those that are responsible for allowing it to continue. And that's the real problem, is having an effective mechanism in place. And it's not just about identifying what's happened. When we look at the numbers, we can see that there is a huge amount of underreporting because of the locations where this occurs, and because there is this sense that nothing will be done, nothing will change. And so what is the point?
So a culture has to change.
It has to.
I wonder, Laurie, whether you think that that is happening now, or whether it will have the momentum of this week and next month and then just crash on the beach like a broken wave.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm very worried about. So there's already a lot of discussion about how do we rebuild the trust. And from my perspective, we're just beginning to tear down this toxic culture of cover-up and of impunity within the entire humanitarian sector. So I don't think we should even begin to talk about rebuilding until we actually restructure how the entire humanitarian aid sector has been operating, which is exactly as Andrew and Toby have said, a culture of impunity and cover-up. And those of us who have been gender advisors, as I have been for more than 20 years, have been hired by these organizations to conduct evaluations and investigations of internal procedures around issues of sexual abuse and exploitation. And when we tell the truth to these organizations, we're then forced out, we're silenced, we're terminated, and we're not listened to. Yeah. And the usual response is, we'll just do another gender training. We can't have any more trainings. Code of conducts don't work. We need prosecution, and we need a restructurement.
So when you write the humanitarian sector must completely tear down this culture of misogyny and foster a turnaround attitude, and so on, how do you think that's going to happen?
Mm-hmm. Well, one very simple procedure, which nobody has yet talked about, would be every single humanitarian agency should install a software. I like NetClean. It was created by a Swedish Marine. It's based out of Sweden. It's a filtering software so that all electronics could be monitored for child pornography, for revenge pornography. When people abuse people, women, children, animals, they almost always video it. So if agencies were monitoring their own electronic workplace, and the electronic infrastructure of an institution is part of their workplace, so that should be monitored. If that was monitored, you'd have the evidence you need to bring the criminal prosecutions. You could also look at, and Toby could speak better to this, the potential of bringing prosecutions in the International Criminal Court if you have internet evidence. Once you send a video of yourself sexually abusing a refugee, you've put that all over the world, so it's an international crime. Okay. So you could potentially start to end the impunity with that.
We will talk about legal procedures in just a moment, and something that the two of you have been discussing beforehand, but I'd like to bring in you, Fadlullah, and you're not in the dock here with Muslim Aid, but it's important that we examine whether you think your attitudes as a charity, as part of the NGO network, need to change, and whether you have, in fact, rigorous enough checks at the moment to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen with your organisation.
I think this whole thing sent a shock through the whole sector, and the NGOs are really, really concerned. And we did have a meeting of all the NGOs with Bond, which is trying to say, well, this is a really serious thing. We have to devote much more resources to this. And in this case, funders must realize that you have to allocate funds to this sort of thing. It's a cost.
Which
and
is the dichotomy, and we'll get onto that in just a moment.
But you want us to do monitoring and evaluation. We have to eradicate this, and we have to have systems in place. So,
can you be certain that there is nobody with these tendencies in your organisation or working for your people?
we have, as far as our organisation is concerned, what we do at the moment is make sure that every person visiting every country from the UK to these countries has a DBS check. That's what we do.
DBS meaning?
It's a database of child abuse and this from the British police.
Yeah, and you employ an awful lot of local workers as well, don't you? Can you check
workers,
them?
It's more difficult to check local workers. If you're in some countries, the local police will not have a database. So we try to check the backgrounds of everybody that works with us. I think most NGOs do. What we also do is you ask for a reference from somebody. They will give you their friends who will give them a good reference. But what we try to do is contact the HR department of these organisations to make sure, are these people clear or clean?
You have an awful lot to say, I do know, but I want to ask you two what you think about what you've heard.
And we do have to improve, but you know, how we reference people, we have to improve.
Okay, well, we'll come to more of that a little bit later, Fadlullah. Thank you. Toby.
But I also think, on the whole referencing point, there's a serious problem when allegations like this are made. It is perhaps looked at internally. That person is allowed to resign for personal or medical reasons. They maintain their benefits. They go to another organisation, and the first organisation doesn't have the courage, and this is not a criticism of your organisation, I must stress that, is that the organisation is not courageous enough to inform other organisations, or when a reference is requested, they are not saying the reasons for why.
But Fadlullah, this is something you were talking about before we came on air, that you're not sure what to do.
And I think there are two problems here. First of all, I think that there is both a legal and moral obligation to report appropriately, whether it's reporting to other organisations or whether it's reporting for prosecution at the national or international level. That's the first thing. The second problem, as you've already highlighted, you can't be sure that those that you're using locally meet certain standards. Well, if you're not sure, then that person should not be hired.
And what Fadlullah has done is given a perfect demonstration of the problem in the industry. Now, Fadlullah and I, we come from the same place. We were both brought up in Tasmania in Australia. But there's two things he said that are critical to understanding this problem. Firstly, he said the industry is in shock. No, it's not. There's no one in the industry that hasn't known that this has been a problem for 30 years. Kofi Annan said failure to crack down on pedophilia was one of his regrets. Ban Ki-moon has said the same. There's been the food for sex scandals in the early 2000s, the whistleblower scandal back in the 1990s.
So is it simply shocked that it's been found out?
It's shocked that they've been caught, not shocked that it exists. But then you ask the critical question, are you sure that there's anyone in your organisation that doesn't have these tendencies? The only honest answer he could have given was no, we're not sure, because we recruit from the general community. This problem is a general community problem. Therefore, in our organisation, it is there. It's not up to us to deny that it exists. It's up to us to put everything in place for detection, training, and critically prosecution. And if you want to know whether a charity is taking this seriously, you ask them just one question. How many of your staff have you reported back to your own national police forces for prosecution for child sex crimes? And if the answer is 0, it means one of two things. Either you're not taking it seriously and you're turning a willful blind eye, or somehow magically you've created the world's best human resource filter, but you're not sharing it with anybody else, which is just as evil.
Okay, you can respond to that in a little while, Fadlullah, and I think you should have the right to do so. But Laurie, let's not only talk about the culture of impunity and hidden, a lack of values, but let's talk about the damage this is doing to the good work that is being done. Because let us not forget that probably 80, 90, maybe even more percentage of those people who go to work for an NGO, the United Nations or a charity, actually want to see something good come out of it. And the damage is incalculable, isn't it?
Well, I disagree. I don't think that there's any damage being done at all. I think that this is an incredibly important moment for the humanitarian sector, and I think it needs to go further. And I disagree with what Toby said about it being a lack of courage about reporting people on. What I've seen as a gender advisor for almost 20 years is that there's a lot of elite white men who believe that they're entitled to these very nice jobs. It's not just about impunity for sexual abuse and exploitation of their own staff and of beneficiaries that they're meant to serve, but it's about very high salaries that they're putting in the bank. They're not paying taxes on often if they're out of their own country. They get danger pay, they get housing, and they are passed along. So as you saw with the Oxfam country director in Haiti, as you saw with Save the Children, then to UNICEF, when they're asked to leave, I believe that the old boys networks make sure that they go quietly, they get a payout, and then they get another nice cushy job.
Yeah.
We just had in the States, Gerald Anderson was at the American Red Cross. He was accused of drugging and raping one of his own employees, and he was passed on to Senior Vice President of Humanitarian Response with Save the Children in America. I mean, this is intentional. This is not about a lack of courage. And on the other side, you see the whistleblowers, which are largely female gender advisors, being pushed out, unemployed, and not brought back into the sector. So I think if we want to talk about the good work that humanitarians do, we need to bring the whistleblowers back in, we need to restructure the sector, and then we need to continue on. You're right that most of the people are not sexual abusers. Most humanitarians are incredible people. Unfortunately, I see the leadership is toxic masculinity. It seems that the leaders at the top level of all the humanitarian organizations I've worked for have this level of toxic masculinity.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you two about
what I
something that
see.
you were discussing before the programme in just a moment. But Fadlullah, I think you should respond to some of the things that have been said. But you're also nodding at something that came from Laurie in Washington.
I think, look, we have to empower the weak, the marginalized people to be able to channel their frustrations, the bad things that are done. We have to improve on that. And it is really sad that the channels for somebody in stress who's faced a disaster, they've lost everything, they're vulnerable, they may be illiterate. How do they channel their thing? Do you create an environment in your organization that enables these people to be heard, and then the perpetrators to be held accountable?
Surely you do if you can. That's part of Hear Their Cries.
And we do. I mean, I think all humanitarian organizations do have whistleblower policies. We do have, policies.
How many people have blown the whistle in your organization?
I'm sorry, can I disagree here for a moment? Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I really hate the word empower because, the women that I know around the world, whether they're refugees and they're vulnerable or they're marginalized, or whether they're very powerful, highly educated, elite humanitarian women, when we speak up, we're silenced. So let me bring up Madeleine Rees. I'm sure Andrew and Toby can speak about Madeleine Rees's case. She was one of the original whistleblowers in Bosnia who said that the Western white men are trafficking women and children in UN vehicles. She was wrongly terminated by the UN for speaking out and being a whistleblower. And that issue of wrongly determination was determined by a UN panel who said she was forced out. Bring her back in. There's a new position open, Deputy Director of UNICEF. UNICEF wants to change the policies. They want to empower women. Bring Madeleine Rees back in to fill Justin's position.
Fadlullah didn't get a chance to finish, so I must give him that opportunity. You've just used the word empower as well.
Sorry.
But I think what you were suggesting, Fadlullah, is that let's hope that people feel they work in an environment where they can say what they think.
They can be able to bring these issues up, and action will be taken.
I think you would both agree in that sense.
We would agree, except that we can't have words on this anymore. We've got to have action. We have had 30 years of policy that's empowering and let's listen to whistleblowers, blah, blah, blah. Stephen King wrote a book called On Writing, and he wrote in that book, you've got to show, don't tell. Don't say so-and-so is unhappy. Say a lonely tear is wandering around the cheek. Don't tell me there is zero tolerance. Demonstrate zero tolerance. Don't tell me you're listening to whistleblowers. Demonstrate that you're listening to whistleblowers. And I don't want to see another policy, another piece of paper. I actually want to see action. If I can pick up on something Laurie has said, because I agree with most of what Laurie has said, but it's not just a gender issue. There is an issue about empowered men, but many of the child victims are boys as well.
Yes.
And many of the senior
Correct.
people in the institutions who have silenced whistleblowers are women. We had a head of UNICEF for many years who was female. We had a head of UNDP for 8 years who was female.
Myanmar.
And the positions of power are important, and there's a danger that if we dress it up just in gender terms, we will make a us versus them, men versus women fight, and it's not that. And I'll I'll finish just with
No,
this.
because we're running out of time. We're running out of time, and this is really important.
A woman to know that child rape is wrong.
There's the old saying, isn't there? Fish rots from the head down. And we've talked about the fact that people on the ground may or may not be prosecuted. You talked about somebody in Bangladesh.
Yeah, well, look, I mean,
I'll stop you there, Fadlan, because I have a question here. It needs to go further than that, doesn't it? It needs to go to the head of the organisation.
Yes.
The buck stops here. So how do you do that?
So before we made this connection between the sex tourism laws in Western economies and aid, no one's talked about this. In Britain, it's unlawful to have sex with a child under the age of 16 anywhere in the world. So if a perpetrator rapes a child in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we can hold them in front of the courts here. But more importantly, it's unlawful to aid, abet or encourage. To what extent is turning a willful blind eye, aiding and abetting and encouraging? And we will work together to find a way in which we find the CEO or a trustee of a British charity and we haul them in front of the court here for turning a willful blind eye. It might be Save the Children, it might be Oxfam, it might be Islamic Relief, but here's the warning for every charity out there. If you don't have the best system in place for prevention, detection and prosecution, we're coming for you, we're going to get you, and we're going to throw you in jail.
Is this going to work, Toby?
Yes, it will. And I think that's the way to address the core problem. And it goes back to what Laurie was said. She's quite right to say that this is not a question of courage. This is a question of closing ranks, of maintaining benefits. And I think you're quite right in the point you make. That's the problem, and that's what has to change. And the only way that you change that is by targeting those CEOs, those heads of those organizations. The reference to Madeleine Rees is, I think, one of the best references that can be made because of what she did and how she was shut down and how subsequently whistleblowers were too afraid to take an initiative.
Yes.
And when they did, they were silenced, they were shut out of the organizations, and their careers were destroyed.
So you are going to look to try and bring some kind of prosecution against somebody who's at the head of a charity.
Yes.
Now, let me ask Fadlan, and I'll say once again, it is not you in the dock, and we appreciate very much that you've actually come on this programme. You may feel like you're a bit of a punching bag at the moment, but you're not. Do you think that kind of action would make people, not necessarily in your position, but people at the head of these organisations say, hang on, we really, really, really do have to do something. It's action, not words. And if they were put in that position, they'd be terrified.
They probably would be terrified, but just to make... the majority of workers in the field are doing enormously good work. And I think we shouldn't, I mean, I've got people in Eastern Ghouta now delivering food to people living in basements. I mean, the courage and the sacrifice of these people, you can't sort of blacken what the work that is being done. So I want to make that point really.
But you know what about it's bad apples?
Yeah. No, there are bad apples. And we have to discipline them and action has to be taken. I think I disagree with you to some extent that people in the UK, at least, these revelations have said, look, we have to do something more about this. We have to.
What will you do in your organisation?
Well, from the very start, our policy is anybody has sex with anybody under 18. Whatever the law is in the country, any of our staff, local staff, local staff, international, anybody, you're out. It's gross misconduct. You're dismissed immediately.
Are you going to change anything?
Well, we would sack anybody who does that.
Are you going to change anything now?
Yes, we are. We're going to improve our system.
Sorry, Laurie.
We're looking at how to improve our reporting mechanism, how to improve the actions.
Me, right here, right now, if there's ever an accusation against any member of your staff, you won't do an internal investigation. You'll immediately take the dossier to the police, both in the country where the incident happened and in the country of their nationality. Immediately give it to police. Yes or no?
Yes, we immediately give it to the police in the country of origin. And now, because of this, we realize that we have to do it in the country where.
So the first time an accusation
domiciled
comes against a British national, I will walk hand in hand with you down to Scotland Yard and help deliver the dossier.
Great.
Is that a promise here on television?
Yeah, we can do that.
Done.
For sure.
Okay. Listen, thank you. Laurie, sorry we couldn't come back to you. We have run out of time, but I think your points have been very well made. And let's hope an awful lot of things happen, that it is action rather than words. You two have made an agreement. You two have made an agreement here on Roundtable. We'll wait to see what happens. Do come back and tell us. But as Andrew has written, he estimates 66,000 rapes over the course of 10 years and sexual exploitation. Yeah, over the course of 10 years. The problem is enormous because we're not just talking about the United Nations, we're talking about a great many different bodies that purport to do good, but may not be doing just that. You've been watching Roundtable with me, David Foster, from all of those on the programme, from Laurie in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.